Well, hi, Joe.
Hey, Hannah.
Back again.
Indeed.
Talking about our last project that was included in that All-America City. So if you haven't listened to our last two episodes in the queue,
Go do it.
go back, listen to those. We're doing kind of a mini recap of the city's participation in the All-America City.
And go watch the video of the All-America City. It's incredible.
Get to see Mayor Cyril Jefferson doing some fun, when I say hi, you say point, high point chants, which is always fun.
He can bring the energy and bring the love, man. Nobody is a bigger cheerleader of High Point than our mayor.
Yeah, but one of the projects that we presented to that national jury was the Greater High Point Food Alliance, which has been probably, I don't think this is much contended, that it's probably one of the most impactful things that's happened to the city of High Point in the last decade. And so what the judges were looking for at the All-America City was proof that your city engaged community voices in a democratic process to solve a community problem. And I mean, the Greater High Point Food Alliance is just the epitome of that.
Yeah, that was still one of the most special things that I think I've been a part of in the city. Was the very first time that we did a food summit.
Yeah.
And we had over 500 people show up to a food summit to talk about food.
Yeah.
It kind of blew me away.
Yeah.
When we were planning that, and I'm not even sure we expected what we got, but there was some real intentionality to have voices of people experiencing food hardship at the table, which doesn't seem like a remarkable concept.
Right.
That you'd want to hear from people experiencing the problem that you're trying to solve.
Totally.
But in community after community after community that have set up these food councils, that is not typically who's
Not
at
the
the
case.
table. It's
Yeah.
government officials, it's food pantry leaders, it's stuff like that. And we were really intentional about it. And Carl, who by the time you're listening to this has retired from the Food Alliance, though I think still heavily engaged in all things High Point, but Carl really took that project and that board and nurtured and built it up over time to be what it is. And it's an incredible story of people and voice and impact and what we can do when we tackle problems together. Yeah,
and I mean, the results speak for themselves. I mean, that's what's amazing to me is the quantitative data is there. We went from number one in the nation for food
Not
insecurity.
a number one we want.
Not a number one.
Not a good number one. Bad number one.
And dropped, to number 14.
Yeah.
And so the results speak for themselves. So I really am excited for everyone to hear directly from the founder and now former executive director of the Greater High Point Food Alliance, Carl Vierling, as well as the executive director of the Hayden Harman Foundation and founder of Growing High Point, Patrick Harman. So let's take a listen. Good afternoon, Carl and Patrick. Thank you both so much for being here. We are really excited to hear more about your work with food security. We are highlighting this as part of our mini-series on High Point's award of the All-America City. And both of you had such a crucial part to play in that presentation, but on a larger scale, the project that we presented that helped win that award. So I'd love for you both to just introduce yourself to get us started, and then we'll talk a little bit more about your work in the city.
Okay, I'm Carl Vierling. I'm the Executive Director of the Greater High Point Food Alliance.
I'm Patrick Harman, Director of the Hayden Harman Foundation and City Council member.
Awesome.
Thanks for being with us, guys.
Looking forward to this.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
All right, so tell us the story, how you got into food security work in High Point. Go back and, because you two have been in it together.
Carl's farther back then.
But give us the story, the inspiration. What drew you into this work?
So it really started in 1990 when I was in Richmond County serving on the United Way Board. That's where I really first learned about food insecurity and hunger. And as a pastor, we started a food program. And when I left the church, I started going around and meeting community leaders. And I would ask them, what is the number one issue in High Point? If you ask a nonprofit leader what the number one issue is, it's always whatever they're doing. but the number two issue was always food insecurity and hunger.
Yeah.
And that's what it was. And I was speaking to some civic group over 10 years ago, and Megan Ward with the High Point Enterprise heard me and said, would you sit down with a reporter and I and talk about how you would do a series about food insecurity and hunger in High Point? And that's how it really got started, was that series of stories.
Can you share a little bit about kind of that landscape of the statistics? Because I know you all have done a ton of research. I know High Point University, when you were there, did a lot of research around this. So feel free to chime in. I said Joe's an expert on this too, I know. So can you share a little bit about those statistics, kind of what that landscape looked like 10, 15, 20 years ago?
What was the story Jimmy Tomlin was telling?
It was about Greensboro High Point MSA being number 2 in the nation in food hardship. And food hardship is about not having enough money to buy the groceries that you and your family need. But when I started looking at all that, I looked at the history of food hardship in this MSA. High Point had always been in the top 5 in the nation for years.
Yeah.
And you start looking at the information for North Carolina, it was always very high compared to other states. So it was the amount of food insecurity, which I think food insecurity at the time might have been 25, 27%.
Yeah.
It was high. And so that's really what drove it, was that we were so high up. And right after we got started, after early January, March of 2015, the Food Research Action Center, FRAC, did another study. And the Greensboro High Point MSA went to number 1 in the nation.
Yeah. So that was 2015, right?
2015.
Yeah.
And thank you for defining that term of food hardship, because I think a lot of these terms kind of get volleyed around of food insecurity, food deserts. Can you explain a little bit to listeners about what kind of defines a food desert?
A food desert is an area that has at least 33% poverty, and it's 1 mile away from a full-service grocery store. Okay. So when you look at a map of High Point, there are 7 food deserts, and they're all contiguous. I mean, we're technically sitting in a food desert right now, right? And one of the biggest challenges we have, and has been going on for years, is the transportation system at High Point. That's a big issue. And a lot of folks either have to walk or they have to rely on somebody else. The other challenge is that we don't have safe passage. We don't have sidewalks that we need.
Yeah.
One of the things that we did a few years ago was do a walk to store event from Highland Mills. If you're going to go from Highland Mills to the Walmart on South Main Street, it's all 4-lane and there are no sidewalks. And that's part of the issue of being in a food desert.
Yeah. And so, Patrick, why don't you tell us a little bit about what pulled you into it? So,
Yeah. Well, I always wish there was some kind of grand story about how you get into things rather than that you just sort of stumble into them. Right?
I got invited to a meeting.
Well, yeah, basically, Steve
I said yes to an email, and now here we are.
Yeah, right.
Well, part of it, I mean, because our foundation works in Alamance County, so just talking about food in general, there's a movement to get a cooperative grocery store, and I was a big part of that. Of course, it has since failed, but a lot of community building around the cooperative grocery store and that model. So it was kind of in my mind. And then with the Washington Street Neighborhood Association, we were always talking about this, because this is like 2011, 2012, about having a community garden in the neighborhood. It was like, well, we couldn't find a leader to do, to lead the effort. And so it was something we talked about. But then Joe started get the AmeriCorps Vistas, right? So these young people started showing up at my front door, which is awesome. And so I guess this is 20.
It was 2014.
Technically, I mean, the Food Alliance is kind of concurrent, so there was kind of a cluster of things that happened, and so we started with this idea of community gardens, and we did container gardens to generate enough interest, and that actually worked.
There were like 4 different iterations of like, well, we tried this one, and some people liked it, but maybe we'll try this one, and okay, more people like that, and then but, like just for a couple of years around the gardening in that area, I know it was a kind of trial and error and trying to talk to community and get people interested in what's going to work. And I think that so much of this story around food, I think how you all kind of got pulled into it, I know how I got pulled into it, connects so much with the story that we're telling about the All America City,
right?
Where it's about voices and democracy and getting voices that are often not heard to the table.
Right.
because I think that was part of the power of Jim Lee Tomlin's storytelling, right?
Was.
He was lifting up stories of voices that were often not heard, and that was so much of what captured my understanding as I was working with you in Washington Street of the individual stories as you're door knocking, as you're talking with people about what do you need, and I can provide you this stuff, but maybe you don't know how to garden.
Right.
And you don't know what to do. And so we got to do that too. And just those individual stories all start to percolate up.
Yeah.
Well, in the very beginning, the goal was to have as much community engagement as possible, right? And I knew that was going to be a key because I had this idea about how to do this from a holistic approach. And I knew community engagement, but it was the two of you in that very first meeting that said, let's do neighborhoods. And so you identified 3 neighborhoods. That's how we got those neighborhoods, was in that very first meeting where you guys, let's do this.
Right.
When you say that very first meeting, was that before the food summit then? Just kind of, okay, so so talk a little bit about the food summit. How did that come about? Because I know when I've heard the story, from my perspective, that's kind of the thing that was really the moment where people are like, that's when it was like Greater High Point Food Alliance is starting. It's a backbone organization. It's going to kind of take on managing and leading these initiatives.
I was asked during those interviews, during those stories, what would I do first? And it was to do a food summit. It was to help people understand what it was. It was to help educate the community, but it was also to have voices. And that really was the goal of the Food Summit, was to hear the voices of those dealing with food insecurity and also generate ideas about how we can address this. We had like 75 action items, 100 action items.
It was a long spreadsheet.
It was a long spreadsheet. But it really was 2 things. There were skeptics. Oh, this can't be true in High Point. Who's the Gallup organization? What do they know about High Point?
Right.
Remember those days?
Oh, yeah.
But that's why we got HP to do what they did. But when you start hearing people's stories, and Joe moderated a town hall forum, and that made all the difference. Now all of a sudden you're hearing from a senior who's skipping their medications, or you're hearing from a working mom who's going to GTCC that doesn't have enough money to buy groceries but goes through McDonald's. That was so impactful.
Yeah, I mean, the first meeting was December 2024.
It was.
2014.
Sorry, 2014. Decade,
That's the
right,
date,
decade
right.
back. Yeah, 2014. And it was pretty audacious to pull off the food
Because
summit
it was within
in
5,
March.
6 months. Or was it March? Is
4
it 4
months.
months?
4
Yeah.
months. Really
Yeah.
3.
Wow.
Really 2.5 when you look at it.
Yeah, I mean, because we held the food summit
March 19th.
March 19th of 2015.
2015? Okay.
And my daughter was born on March 13th of 2015. So I remember being completely deliriously sleep deprived, but there, and just blown away by the breadth of community involvement, by the number of people that showed up. And your foundation was really critical at helping, to literally compensate people for their time, because many of us were compensated by our jobs for being there, right? And it's part of my job. I was getting paid to participate. But you all helped to compensate with Food Line gift cards, and HP provided buses and transportation from neighborhoods. And
so,
it was really intentional. It wasn't like we'll just hope people show up. It was like really intentional. We have to get voices to the table.
And I guess, Carl, I know your background, you've had human resources background, you've had pastoral background. Why was it so important to have so many voices at the table and not just have it be 5 or 6, stakeholder decision makers, investors, kind of have that conversation?
It really goes back to my time in Richmond County. And we went through a horrific event there, the Hamlet Food Fire. And I was on that board for the United Way when that happened. And a lot of it was about getting community voices. But even working in the facility, we had quality circles. And the best ideas came from the people working in the manufacturing facility. And that really is what generated a lot of it. It was also, when I was on that United Way board, I was very much a pull up your boots type guy. Really, that was my motto. And But I started asking people their story. It was the stories. And as we were doing things in the community, I asked people their story. And that made a huge impact.
Yeah.
And I think that's why that was so important.
What were some of those stories that came out of that first food summit, or even those first years of running the Food Alliance, that kind of stuck with you or kind of helped set the tone for how the Food Alliance and Growing High Point eventually would operate?
It was being at Burns Hill when they opened up that food pantry. And we all had a hand in that. And knowing the demographics of Burns Hill, that they have such a high concentration of poverty, number 3 in the state. And there was an elderly black lady there. And I started talking with her and I asked her, I said, have you ever been to a food pantry before? And she said, no. And I said, well, you know what Open Door is? She said, never been there, don't know where that is. And she had a little red wagon. And I said, well, what's the wagon for? She said, well, I don't have transportation. I don't have a car. This is going to help me get the groceries back home, right? It was talking with people going to West End for that hot meal that they were doing and why they did it. There was a time I was doing a Bible study outside for the homeless on English and learning their stories, right? And because there's power in the story. You can have all the data that you want, but if you don't put a face on it, it means absolutely nothing. So that was some of it. Some of it was actually watching neighbors become engaged. Like Mr. Sherman. I love Mr. Sherman down in Burns Hill. Or Jerry Mingo, right? And hearing their stories, their background about why they were involved. There were so many. And then it was, as I was doing stuff in the church and in the community, there's 1,000 stories out there.
Well, I think to the gardens and how those became catalysts for neighborhood and neighbors engaging each other.
Yeah.
I mean, stories come to your mind of people coming out of their doors while you're building hoop houses and.
So there's like, Jerry Mingo, they were interested in the community garden, and then Cedar Street as a follow-on to the container gardens. So while I was away, Victoria worked at all these groups and sort of planted these 3 community gardens in 4 months, right? And that's kind of what led into Growing High Point. But I mean, all these come from conversations with neighbors. I mean, anything basically the foundation has done in High Point is from conversations on the front porch, basically. Supporting DUP and the need for after-school programming and the food insecurity and all that sort of stuff comes from conversations.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna plug High Point Discovered's article that we did on food security because when I first met with you, Carl, and talked about it, you were very adamant that the Greater High Point Food Alliance was not the one administering the programs. You were just the backbone, and you had that map that has like 1,000 arrows on it and like hundreds of logos of all the different places that are involved, right? And we'll put a link in the show notes so people can see that. But I think what really surprised me and encouraged me and made me think like this is a model that could solve hypothetically, or at least improve any community challenge, is that idea of what are the elements that have to be involved to make this problem get better. I know you've said before, we're never going to solve hunger. We're never going to solve poverty or illiteracy, right? But we can improve that because there are all these elements. And so when I think about the Food Alliance, I think about, okay, it's the urban agriculture, it's the actual access gardening process, it's the education about those, it's the accessibility of the resources through things like the farmers market offering those benefits of double the bucks and some of those things. So can you just kind of list what are some of those key elements to a sustainable food model that have to be present in a community?
First off, you have to have a champion and somebody who has a vision for how things can go, right? You have to involve all these different folks. And you try and find the intersection of mission for these organizations. Where can we work together? And then you start building relationships, and it takes time to build relationships. And there's a lot of give and take in all that. You spend time, like Patrick has done, asking the questions of the people in the community. Those are the real experts, right? What do you think? The question was always the same. The question was, how would you help us solve this problem? What do you want to do in your neighborhood? I used to go into plants that were in trouble, and I always ask people, If I gave you a magic wand, what's the first thing you're going to do, right? So it was the same concept. Let's ask them what they think, and let's let them establish the goals. The goals were never ours. The goals were theirs.
Yeah.
Our job was to help them get the resources they needed. It was also to help build capacity within these organizations. How do we help improve the system? How do we help improve the organizations? And oh, by the way, it's not about us, it's all about you.
Yeah.
Right? And we have done the best that we can to deflect the praise, because it really is the people in the community. It's the folks that are doing the work day in and day out. But somebody has to do the resource mapping, asset mapping. Long before there was a Food Alliance, I was doing asset mapping at High Point, right? Just to see where are all the resources and how does this fit together. The other thing that's really important as you think about this is how are all these different systems connected? How is literacy and education connected to food insecurity? How is healthcare and life expectancy rates, how is that connected? How is it connected to economic development? It's understanding that you have to have a 50,000-foot view of how all these pieces are connected, and how can they work together with a common goal?
Because none of it exists in a vacuum.
None.
No, I mean, that's why your collaboration chart is so complex, because food intersects with every aspect of life, right? And I think of the initiatives that have come from neighborhoods, and because they're coming from people at particular points in time, they often would come up. We'd work on them for a while. I think we'd make good progress on things, and then another one would come up. So like it was iterative. It changed regularly. I mean, we've had a number over time, different focuses on food that is specific to immigrant populations, or really working with food pantries. I know we were very intentional for a while, like let's train food pantries around food for people with health issues, and the amount of sodium in the food, and what about gluten-free options, and what about religious restrictions for food, and really like working with food pantries around that.
Even cooking and recipes. I
Yeah,
remember.
we did a lot of recipe production over the years.
I remember Jerry had a Vista who helped him, Gabby, I think.
Yeah.
Gabby
Yeah.
put together all those menu cards, right?
Yeah.
Of like, hey, baby, you are receiving this food, but you don't know how to cook it. Like all those elements that people, I think, can gloss over quickly.
Well, and those menu cards, and because we did that, the Vistas put together recipe books and menu cards kind of repeatedly, because they were, from my perspective with them, they were conversation starters for the Vistas, because they forced them to go out, knock on doors, talk to people.
Yeah.
What's your favorite recipe? What's your family story behind it? Like, you don't just hand somebody a recipe, you tell them a story with it.
Love that.
So it was a way really of engaging, building relationships with the Vistas, but those recipes constantly kind of change, and then you think, like, oh, well, maybe we should do healthier recipes. One year we have all these great recipes. Maybe we should focus on the fresh food recipes. And so, we try to do it better, and then it's like, well, but, so we're not going to eat that, so let's try this. And I mean, that iterative, just constant flexibility, I think, is so much a part of democratic engagement.
Yeah.
Like when we talk about what it really means to engage with people, there does seem to be this, have to be this openness and this willingness to be flexible and change and responsive to that. I mean,
Well, a great example is that this summer, Sarah, who was our AmeriCorps Vista, created an international food guide and went out and did focus groups. We got grant funding from Ann Moore, and she went out and did focus groups, and we gave them all cards and all that kind of stuff. So now we have this culturally appropriate food guide that lists all the major people groups and the holidays and the foods, right?
Wow.
And now we're working on purchasing meats from halal markets with our current Vista, Zyra. And so, but it comes from the data, right? That 14% of our population speaks another language. The other thing is that I was at different food pantries talking with Muslims, and we can't eat that. Oh, we can't eat that. Oh, we can't eat that. I experienced the same thing in Greensboro when I was pastoring. But it's always changing, because this area is always changing. And if you don't own it, it's okay.
Yeah.
Let somebody else own it. Let somebody else do it.
Well, you mentioned also in terms of thinking about not just, you're coming to a food pantry, so you get what you get, right? Like, it's not just, oh, here's
Right.
10 cans of corn, right?
Right.
And so, like,
Right. It's
right,
about
because
dignity,
we,
right?
right, because we, and I've heard people say before, like, there's this probably well-intentioned, but it becomes this kind of power dynamic of like, I'm giving something to you so you can take what you get, right? And Jerry did such a good job of explaining, like, that's why he put so much into the community garden, because he was like, I want people to come and be able to get like fresh, good produce from a food pantry. I want them to get those kinds of things. So Patrick, when it comes to growing High Point, I mean, it's iterated a lot, I know,
Yes.
from the beginning.
It
And
may
you've
be.
got the food hub, you've got all of these different
Right,
things.
yeah.
So can you kind of walk through what that looks like and how that contributes to not just providing something, but providing actually something good and healthy and
Right.
filling to our community?
That's a long story. I give Carl credit because it was his idea in a way about entrepreneurial gardens.
Yeah.
That people could, grow and sell some produce. They could make some side money, and it's significant in a low-income community. And that's kind of what kind of kicked the idea off. And then with Victoria doing all these things, I was out of the country.
she
I was like,
she
let's-
went rogue.
That's
on
right.
you.
Yeah, so let's try this idea about. I think it was called From the Ground Up then.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
But
yeah.
in the first year, it was like, Victoria, I want you to do all the things, right? From nuts to bolts, because it's complicated. You don't know what you don't know, right? In terms of the infrastructures for a community garden, it's several $1,000s, and so it's not,
Right.
okay, community, go do a community garden. It's like, well, we
Right.
don't have that kind of money to do that sort of stuff. So we learned quite a lot. And that's one reason we have a food hub, because it's like you harvest, you take it home, you wash it in your sink, you stick it in your fridge. That's not sustainable, right?
Right.
So that's
Especially
how-
the volume. I mean,
right,
like,
yeah, that
Yeah.
was
They
the,
have
that
a-
was the early days too.
they have a
Yeah.
walk-in like
Right.
fridge. It's not just like they're getting a couple peppers off the vine. They're
Right,
getting
yeah,
like
right, yeah, and it's
quantities.
more and more. Yeah, and we need a bigger food hub actually, which is in the plans with the bridge project. But yeah, so lots of lessons with that early on. I mean, the community engagement thing really is a key thing, because we ended up with, we called it urban farm leaders, folks who were growing and selling.
Yeah.
I recruited a bunch of them because we had volunteer days, and people would show up and they get interested. And I mean, a lot of people come and go because they get excited and the weeds come, and it's not as much fun in the summertime.
It's hot.
So it
It's
gets
hot. I've been out there in the summer.
Right. So that's kind of a normal thing. But yeah, just things evolve from talking with folks, right?
Yeah.
About even like starts within the greenhouse, right? So we give them to the neighbors and all that sort of stuff. I mean, we also sell them and that sort of stuff. And then the Grodega, I mean, we had talked about that, kind of a mobile market, and then COVID happened, right? And so there was this money available, and said, hey, Victoria, let's do this mobile grocery store. And so we got money from the city and the St. Mary's, and then the city donated the old bookmobile, and so that got kicked off during COVID, and so.
Because for people who don't know, I just wanted to interject. The Grodega actually takes the produce grown from those farms
Right.
and actually sets up pop-ups, right, in neighborhoods that are
Right.
considered located in a food desert.
Right. Yeah, when we got the Double the Bucks program and all that sort of stuff. And a lot of times the library, the current library bookmobile will show up as well. So we get, amplified effects. I mean, that's one thing we've learned with all the gardens. There's been houses renovated near every garden in town. It's happened over and over and
Really?
over and over. Yep. So you get these spillover effects from a community garden.
Yeah, I mean, it's surprising and actually, nationally well documented now, like the impact that community gardens have on
Right.
economic development in neighborhoods, safety within neighborhoods, sense of community within neighborhoods,
Sure,
even
sense of ownership.
parents showing
Right.
up at PTA meetings and there are just so many spillover effects from getting people out of their houses
Right,
together,
right, in the same
meeting
space,
each
right.
other.
Yeah. Like we did the urban farm fair and all kinds of different stuff over the years. But I mean, of course, things have changed and evolved with growing High Point. Had it's the third director currently, and so. But a recent thing from the beginning, Andre, who was one of the early farm leaders, is always getting kids to come in. Hey, come in and help me with the garden, and so early on we wanted to have a youth kind of component. And so we had small versions, but when Jody came, really, amplified it. We have like 20 teenagers out there, not just on the farms, but also selling at the farmers market. So they're learning customer service and soft skills and all that sort of stuff. And one of the original ones actually is a mentor now to the younger ones. And then more recently, with the Urban Farm Leaders, been partnering with the refugee community, and so there's a number of farms being farmed by recent refugees, and of course then they're selling the produce, the Grodega, and so that's a recent element that's got amplified again. So it's very cool.
In our initial conversation that we talked with Michael and Tasha about the All America City Award, one of the things we talked about was the uniqueness of the High Point presentation in Denver that included this skeptic.
Right, yeah, it's brilliant.
That's awesome.
Right. I think that's been an important part of the food story. Both growing High Point and the Greater High Point Food Alliance have had skeptics and have been out in communities where people are like, what in the world are you doing? Or why would you do that? Or it's just a little garden. What are we doing that for? Can you say a little bit about how the skeptics have changed over time? Because that's part of the presentation with the All America City was the skeptic who gets pulled in, you know, those letters to the editor that in 2014 were all over the paper of we can't have hunger here because look at how obese our population is, right? Not understanding connections between obesity and food insecurity, or, I mean, just the litany of skepticism.
The emails.
The email.
Oh my gosh. So I think one of the things that happened is that we did what we said we were going to do. And I remember there was a letter to the editor that said, these are all well-intentioned folks. They won't be there a year from now.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, you don't know us.
Yeah, right.
You don't know. And but it's because we meant what we said.
Yeah.
And then we went out and did it. And a big part of that was because it was community voices. And when we had the wins, we shared the wins. And then we were able to show progress, that things were getting better.
Yeah.
Right? We were now bringing in resources that weren't here before. There was one program after 5 years, it brought in over $7 million worth of food.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at our budget, that's really a great investment. The other thing that we talked a lot about was return on investment, right? It was that ROI. So every time that there's a community garden built and managed, that is disposable income that's being created. And we shared those numbers with City Council at one time. Said this one garden will generate $175,000 in disposable income because this is food that folks in this neighborhood don't have to go out and buy. They can spend that money on medication, on a doctor's visit, on other essentials of life. So these gardens are creating income.
Well, and in those early years, you were really intentional about turning skeptics into friends.
We were.
Because you went and worked with some of the organizations that were looking at the Food Alliance and saying you're not going to exist, or you're not making an impact, or that's our lane, get out of here, or being really territorial.
Yes.
And there were a lot of silos. And I think one of the biggest things that you as an executive director and then also the members of your board did, brought down, tried to lower the anxiety and the territorialism, and just kept at it to we got to work together.
Got to work together.
We got to work together.
Well, the other thing that happened is that we started bringing resources into our greatest critics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The Food Security Fund's a great example, but it's also the capacity building that we were doing. And there was so much, well, what do you guys know about food insecurity? Well, we have a little bit of knowledge, right? But we actually helped bring in resources. We made other connections for them. We were referring volunteers to them.
You brought in Vistas,
Bonners,
HPU, service learning students started going
stuff.
everywhere, and then donors.
Yes.
So many donors who didn't understand food insecurity understood it because of the Food Alliance, and started making donations not to the Food Alliance, but to all the other agencies.
All the other agencies.
And it's interesting because for me, I grew up in High Point, moved away, came back in 2020, but in college I actually did an internship at the High Point Enterprise, and Megan was my boss, and she had me write articles about food insecurity, and I was like, oh, this is new. Now I would say everyone in High Point thinks about food as something that they can immediately get involved with, help with, invest in, and those qualitative results are great, but can you talk a little bit about the quantitative results? Like, what has changed in the statistics since 2015?
So the last time FRAC did a study, the Greensboro High Point MSA was number 14 in the nation in food hardship. We did the study with HPU in 2016, 2021, we did another study. Food insecurity had actually improved by 7 points. That was
Even in
significant.
COVID.
That's a
I mean,
lot of households.
Yeah.
That's a lot of households. It improved by 7 points, and that was coming out of COVID.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? And so we also were keeping track of where people were going. One of the big things was that food pantries and others were getting more resources. That really made a difference. So you not only look at the metrics, but you look at what's now available compared to 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, and the efficiency of what's going in, right?
Yeah.
And because I think of all of the work, food pantries are not all created equal.
They're not.
And I think that's a lot of what the Food Alliance did over the years, was educating food pantries of, we're not going to do this random box of stuff you pulled out of your pantry and give it to somebody and be done. We're going to do client choice models where people are picking the food their families are actually going to eat, right? I can't imagine taking a random food box home and trying to feed my kids with it.
No.
They're going to be like, my daughter's a vegetarian and my son can be a little picky. I'm like, you're just not going to eat some of the stuff that's in it, right? And that all kids are kind of like that, unless you just have a lot of chicken strips in your, food boxes. But creating those efficiencies where it's not just more money's coming into the system, but that money's being used better. And I think the point you made earlier, we broke the mentality that it's a zero-sum game.
Yes. Well, and so part of it was during COVID, we got the dollars from the Foundation for Healthy High Point, and we went out and did capacity building during COVID. Everybody else was shut down. We were meeting with food pantry leaders. We not only talked about what they needed to become more efficient, and we purchased a ton of equipment, but how can we help your operations? We actually created a diagram, a flow chart, helping them become more efficient, right? And then you follow that up with doing the Growing Towards Leadership classes for nonprofit leaders and food pantry leaders. They've never had the opportunity to go through any kind of leadership training. And we talk about all the things that are necessary to run a good organization.
I mentioned to Tasha and Michael, it's like, it wasn't always that way in High Point.
Right.
And when I think about the transformation of the city and how that collaboration, how we've gotten to the place where we are working together, I really think there are spillover effects from the work that the Food Alliance and Growing High Point were doing to bring voices to the table and take down the walls that were dividing.
And the competitiveness.
And that disproving this zero-sum mentality, saying, look, the pie can get bigger.
That's right.
If we're all working together.
Yeah.
I think that spilled over to the whole city. I don't think it just stayed in the little food nonprofits.
No, I agree.
Well, and part of it too is that we moved away from a charity model.
Yeah, say more about that. for
Define
folks.
that.
So a charity model is where you raise money and just go out and buy food, right? You just do that. Instead of looking at what's the real issue here. The real issue is nutrition. It's a lack of access. It really is, as Cyril would say, taking that upstream approach.
Yeah.
What are the real issues here? We don't want to just get food. We actually want to solve this problem. And maybe it's a policy issue. Maybe it's a SNAP issue. Maybe it's a WIC issue. But whatever it may be, it's how do you solve the issue? And getting people to see that they're just not giving, they're making investments in the community. And there should be some expectation of change.
But there's consistency that you all have put to, because the Food Summit, we didn't say this, but it wasn't a one-time thing. It's annual. I mean, you're having, to the skeptics' points who said this wouldn't last. I mean, it's lasted though, because people continually show up every single year and say this is not a problem that gets solved. It's a problem that we keep facing, that we keep fighting for, that we keep trying to improve. When we were at the All America City competition, backing up, when the city approached High Point Discovered about being part of kind of creating that story, and we were thinking about what things are, democratic in nature, the Food Alliance was top of mind because it was that community impact model. when we were at the competition, I know that both of you gentlemen had the opportunity to present kind of at that round table format, which I'm sure you're used to, having round tables at the Food Summit every year. But can you share a little bit about what that experience was like, and maybe even conversations you had with people about other challenges in their cities?
I think they're always shocked. I think, I mean, at the impacts, sort of how did you do it is always the question.
Yeah.
Not sure if I ever have a good answer for that. But I mean, it's this long-term commitment, right? I mean, that if you're going to do this work, you know, how long do you have, right? How many years do you have? Because when I first hired Victoria, she thought I was joking. I said, I need 5 years, right? I got 4, so she still owes me a year. It's like, that's okay, I'll get it back. But yeah, so, I mean, because from nurturing, growing High Point from 2016, creating its own thing. I mean, it took, 5 years of just nurturing, right, and just sort of stick to it, and it's every day, right, and there's not a whole lot of glamour to it. Then all of a sudden you're successful, and people want to know how you did it.
Yes,
It's like,
an overnight success
day,
after a decade of work, right?
Yeah.
But it's also the partnerships and everything and the conversations that happen. I mean, because I did a little study about how this nonprofit sort of responded to COVID, which is better than some people around here. I was very frustrated with that at the time.
We both were.
Right, yeah. So, but I made you think, what do you need? Carl, what do you need? D-Up, what do you need? Let's get it to you. I mean, so it's those relationships can facilitate quicker action. But I mean, it obviously does take a bit of money to do these things as resources. So that's the biggest thing I remember from the round table.
I think part of it too was how people work together, but the other part was how the city of High Point was actually invested in this. When you looked at, we were talking to other cities, it's we have this adopt a lot policy that nonprofits can adopt vacant city property for $1 a year. It is the in-kind program of getting soil and mulch from Ingleside. It's that they will help with other things, right? That they will actually look at changing zoning or code to get chickens and to sell the eggs, right? It's what City of High Point was doing. And then the other big ask or big question was about the resource guides and the Food Finder app.
Yes, yeah.
Right? That was huge. And because people had not thought, hadn't thought about it, but we were actually doing it.
Yeah.
And I remember where Joe and I learned about that for the first time.
Yeah.
And we took what they were doing in Winston-Salem, we just put it on steroids.
Yeah.
In the last year, that app has had 83,000 screen views.
Wow.
Right? And you have to be dedicated.
Yeah.
You have to, it takes money to actually do this resource guide and to do the app. It's
Because
really,
you have to constantly update.
Because the app
Right.
is like you're able to look at your geographic area and see where there is available food pantries, or how does that work?
the way it works is that you
So
look,
first, give us the name of the app so
Okay,
people can go look for it
it's called the
in the
Greater,
App Store.
it's the Greater Guilford Food Finder.
Okay, great. We'll link
And-
that.
And so we actually expanded it last year to all of Guilford County. And what happens is you pull up right where you are, and it'll list all the food pantries closest to you where your current location is.
Great.
And you can also sort it by city. We've got it sorted by city across Guilford County, Archdale, Trinity. And it has all the information. What are their hours? What do they require? And people are using that app.
And it's more than food pantries.
It is about
Right.
food pantries, community gardens, urban farms. It's about community meals. It's also other resources like for seniors. It's emergency assistance. It's got a thing on there for homelessness. It's also got a piece on there for mental health.
And we've had the summer feeding sites
Summer
for
feeding
Guilford
sites,
County
yep.
Schools
We'll
has
do
been
that.
on there. I mean, it's a fantastic resource because it's trying to take all of these things that are happening, that are resources to people, and provide a way for people to know what's going on, which it was so much of the issue under the kind of old siloed model. There wasn't any incentive to share information because you wanted to kind of control it. One organization wanted to kind of control it. They didn't want to participate in this broad effort, and just the app, I think, exemplifies what that kind of collaboration actually can turn into.
One of the really cool things about the app is that when you look at the metrics, that it's used by the same person 18 different times in a year. And what that tells you, this is frontline workers, the police officers. Both Greensboro and High Point have not only the app, they've got the resource guides in their patrol cars. That's cool, right? And so now we're trying to figure out ways that we can get into more hands doing that frontline work. But it's the social workers, it's the people at the hospital, it's the nurses.
Schools.
It's church secretaries that are taking phone calls. The library I know uses it a lot.
They do,
Right.
And but that was unique. The other thing I think surprised people was really the community engagement piece, like what Patrick was talking about. That we would actually go out and ask people what they think. What a unique concept.
Yeah, and I think,
Secret sauce.
I think like, again, it made me think when we were in Denver, how many other cities could utilize that community impact model to solve whatever that, number one, number two challenge is in their city, because this isn't unique to the food landscape. This is just a way of kind of democratizing that community engagement to make sure that problems get solved.
Yeah.
Well, and we're having conversations with other groups like High Point School Partnership. We've talked about this. I've had conversations with folks down in Rocky Mount about how we do this, right? You can take this model and use it for any issue.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, as you all are thinking kind of to the future of High Point, we now have this designation. We're an All-America city. I'm curious what that designation means to you. What do you think it means for the city to have that? And I guess what you're looking at next, right? Like, we can't stop.
Right, we can't stop. It's a start, right?
Right. So like, what does the designation mean? And then kind of what's next up?
I hope it's an impetus to do bigger and better things. I mean, that's my life, really, to do bigger and better things. Because when I'm an ED of a private foundation, right? And it occurred to me like 2008 or 9. My job was to make things happen, right? I'm not the ED. I'm trying to make things happen, and that sort of takes me through whatever we're doing, like the New Bridge initiative, that in a way modeled in a way off the Food Alliance and its values anyway, and ethos. And that's the biggest part for me, is that this is just the beginning. I mean, it's nice to reflect and go, hey, we've done some cool stuff in here, and we've had a big impact and all that sort of stuff, but we got a long way to go. So. But it shows we can do it, though.
What do you think, Carl, with the...
It was very humbling to be recognized, but I also think it sent a message that other communities can do this work, right? And you asked a question when we were together for the last rehearsal. You asked, who are we thinking about as we're there? And I thought about Jerry Mingo, and I shared that as we prayed, right? I shared about Jerry. And what it reminds me constantly is that the real heroes are those that no one will ever know. It's the Jerrys, it's the Shermans, it's Louise, it's Steve, it's Chris, all these different folks, that they're really the heart of the community. They really are. And it also means that we can take on bigger and more important issues and actually make progress. How do we improve the life expectancy rate in 27260, right? No reason why there should be a 29-year difference in life expectancy based on where you live. So how can we take these concepts and how can we bring more people together to solve bigger issues, to improve the quality of life, and also improve life outcomes?
Yeah. Well, thank you, gentlemen, so much for being here, and thank you for your work in the city. I mean, as Joe said, I think we can see the trickle over effect into so much of the way we've developed, and we shared it with Tasha and Michael that, the thing I hear time and time again is how impressed people are with this public-private philanthropic partnership that happens in High Point. And I think that, the Food Alliance is just one huge piece of evidence of that kind of collaboration. So.
And I have to take a moment to thank Carl. because you're retiring from the Food Alliance,
Right.
though not from civic engagement and
No.
public life. So I'm very curious and interested to see what the next chapter of your pushing for good things to happen in our community will be. But I just want to thank you so much, because your personality and your compassion and your love is written into the fiber of the Food Alliance. And it's so clear that that organizational identity has been so deeply shaped by who you are. And so I just, thank you for you and for everything that you've done to shape that organization. I'm sure it's going to continue to do amazing and wonderful things, but I'm also excited to see the amazing and wonderful things you go and do.
I'm curious too. So, can I say something though? I said this yesterday to Eli, who's our current board. None of this would have been possible without all the board members that we've had, right? I mean, Patrick and Joe, Victoria was a chair for us at one time, but it's been their involvement and it's been their buy-in into this. And I reminded Eli yesterday that the Food Alliance doesn't belong to me. The Food Alliance belongs to the community. And we're unique in that way, right? That this was a community initiative. I remember when I first met Joe, we went to Greensboro together. And what a meeting.
An ill-fated meeting.
It was very much so. We never went back. But it's been what has so inspired me is how the community bought in, right? And it's just continued to grow. And it's the relationships that we've been able to build and the friendships that we've been able to make. And we've all come together because we truly want this city to be that city on a hill.
Yeah.
We want to be good for all people.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much.
Thank y'all.
Yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Oh, that was great.
I just love hearing Carl talk about it, because he is so passionate about it, and you feel the emotion behind it, but also the expertise and excellence that he's brought to the Alliance. It's
Well, and I mean, you can see the impact that group has made and why it's been so impactful. But I will also say, just in the last week, I've met with several food pantry leaders who say, we have more people coming now than we ever have before.
really,
And so while, we've dropped in the numbers and
Yeah.
the Food Alliance is bringing people together and is solving big problems, the need,
Yeah.
we go to the grocery store, the rising food
right,
prices.
right.
Like, people need food assistance now more than ever because
Yeah.
their rents have skyrocketed, their food prices have skyrocketed. And I'm really glad that we have a Food Alliance that is so established and we have such a network, because if we didn't have it,
Right.
it'd be 10 times worse than what we're dealing with.
Oh, completely.
But
yeah.
I want to urge everyone who's listening to be part of the solution and get engaged with the Food Alliance or with local food pantries or food service agencies, backpack programs, something, because this is definitely still
Yeah.
a challenge that we
Yeah.
as a city are working on. We're just fortunate to have an approach
Right.
that brings in voices.
That's a really great point, Joe, because it's not that they're doing the work that solves every problem.
Right.
They're just setting up the framework for all of us to be involved and actually being the change makers to serve our neighbors and help each other. And so I think not to get comfortable or complacent with the work that they've done, but instead to capitalize on that. So we'll make sure to link all of their stuff below, because they've got a great resource guide that explains all the different ways to get involved, different food pantries to donate to, and different organizations that compile kind of that work together.
Yeah, and a great app you can download.
The Food Finder app.
The Food Finder, the Greater Guilford Food Finder app, and get all of that information yourself to share with others. But I think what's powerful in what you just said is them giving this forum where others engage. And I think that's what we've heard through all three of these All-America City episodes. We were awarded an All-America City because we're getting our residents engaged.
Yep.
And this is an ongoing project, right? Democracy is always something that you have to work on. You can't sit back and disengage. And I just want to encourage more and more people to engage.
Right.
Because that's the magic of the city.
Yeah.
When we engage, we get better.
Yeah.
When we sit back and we disengage, then, nothing moves forward in the city.
Yeah. And if you're wondering how to get involved, I think a great place to start are these episodes that we've been doing for the last year. There's so many great nonprofits. We only scratched the surface of the work being done.
Absolutely.
But any of those are a great starting point if you're looking for a way to get engaged or to discover something new. You can also visit highpointdiscovered.org/explore and click on the button that says Good Works, and you can actually filter through all of the different nonprofit opportunities we have in the city, ways to give time, money, energy, resources, or even just to spread the word. I mean, that's what we've been trying to do
That's right.
for the last year, is just spread the word of all the good happening in High Point.
Yeah, and it's why, the Cognitive Foundation has made an investment in High Point Discovered because you all tell that story.
Yeah.
And if people aren't telling the story, lifting up the voices, we don't realize the incredible work that's happening.
Right.
So I want to echo that. This has been so much fun over the last, I don't even know how many episodes now, of getting to work with you, Hannah, and talk to people and hear stories of impact. And I just want to urge all of our listeners to go and listen to those stories and find the thing that you're passionate about and get engaged. Because it's, one of the joys of my job is I get to do stuff like this and hang out with people like you and learn things about our city. And once you start digging in, it's really incredible.
Yeah, I completely agree. Well, this is not the end of High Point's Voices Discovered. It's just the end of this chapter.
That's right.
But so much more good stuff to come. So we just want to say on behalf of High Point Discovered and the city, thank you so much to the Earl and Catherine Congdon Family Foundation for their demonstrated belief and investment in the city and in advocating for those stories to be told and for people to get involved in doing the good work of raising our whole city.
Well, thank you.
Huge thank you.
I'd love being here. Carry the torch forward and tell some more good stories, Hannah.
We will. Thank you to our guests, Carl and Patrick, for being on this episode. Yeah. Thank you again for being here. And thank you to our technical producers at Captivate Media.
They're the best.
We can't wait to tell a lot more stories in the city of High Point, and we hope that you'll continue following along with us.